Welcome back to the Modern Recruiter podcast. I'm Shannon Castleman, Senior Manager of Talent Acquisition here at Greenhouse Software. And this is the show where we get into the real work of recruiting and what the job actually looks like day to day. And today's guest is someone who has spent years studying exactly that. Madeline Laurano is the founder of Aptitude Research, one of the most respected independent research firms covering the HR tech landscape. And more specifically, Madeline just published a new report, sponsored by Greenhouse, called The State of the Recruiter Experience. It builds on research she first published in 2021, but through the lens of how it's evolved through today. Madeline, thank you so much for being here to start us off. Can you tell listeners a little bit about yourself and the work you do at Aptitude?
Hi, Shannon. I'm thrilled to be here. I am thrilled to have done this report with Greenhouse too. So I've been an analyst for about 21 years. So I've studied the HR technology market. I've focused a lot on talent acquisition. I've started this firm, Aptitude Research, about 11 years ago, and we do research on the market, and we do it through surveys, and then we do it through a lot of interviews. So I'm very fortunate to have worked with Greenhouse on this project. We did a report on the recruiter experience in 2021, and then to your point, we revisited that topic this year because it's changed quite a bit. Some things have changed, actually, some things have not changed.
Yeah, and that was actually going to be what I want to check in with you about first, is just like what made you want to revisit it now, and what maybe surprised you most when you came back to it almost 5 years later?
So it's interesting. When we did the report in 2021, it was on the week that we decided to do this report, there were more job postings on LinkedIn for recruiters than there were for engineers. And at the time, that was a very big deal. So recruiters were getting recruited to work for other firms. Often their salaries were doubling or even tripling. During that time, it was a very hard position for companies to fill. And it was a very important position because companies were hiring more people than ever before in 2021. Fast forward 5 years later, and the situation's very different today. There's not as much hiring. The challenge of finding applicants has really changed to managing volume. And the recruiter experience is still incredibly important, probably more important than ever before, but it's just as misunderstood as it was in 2021. So we've always done research to try to understand the technology landscape, to help TA leaders. This was the first research report. We really wanted to focus on the people that actually do the work, that do the job. And I said this at the Open for Ops event. This was really meant to be our love letter to recruiters. We believe this is such an important profession. It's meaningful work. It's work that benefits an organization. It benefits the lives of individuals. And we wanted to validate the experience and recognize the opportunity in front of a lot of recruiters.
Yeah, and I think that makes complete sense. I mean, I remember the recruiting landscape in 2021, and it was extremely hot, exactly how you had mentioned. And so I'm curious, like now looking at today and kind of an overview of the report, like how would you describe the recruiter experience today if you were to sum it up?
So if I think about one word, and this came up a lot at Open for Ops too, it's overwhelmed. I think a lot of recruiters feel completely overwhelmed. For a lot of recruiting teams, they may have reduced the size of their teams. They're doing double, triple the amount of work than they've done ever before, especially in the past 5 years. And when you think about new responsibilities, new pressures, candidate fraud, the emergence of agentic AI, thinking about different candidate expectations than we've ever seen before, the pressures and the responsibilities have increased, and yet we're seeing less resources than we've ever seen before. So I think overwhelmed is definitely the word that I would use to describe it. And what we found in 2021 is that 58% of recruiters didn't feel that senior leaders understood their role within the organization. This year, we found 64%. So feeling misunderstood and at the same time overwhelmed is a challenging position to be in.
I love how you said it's a love letter to recruiters in that way, because even, I've chatted with my own team to ask them how they're feeling. And, sometimes you think, oh, the recruiting job maybe is a lot easier now because of AI and because of all these tools that didn't exist in 2021 when we were having tons of recs and tons of jobs in this big boom. But what I love is that your data really supports that. So it changes it from just a feeling to no, like this is actually what's currently happening and this is why. And it gives recruiters that ammo to back up some of that feeling of overwhelmingness that you said.
Absolutely. And I think one of the reasons we wanted to do this report too is because there's so much discussion around AI, right? We're going to talk a lot about that on our time here today together.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of confusion around AI. And I think everyone is trying to figure out, okay, what should recruiters do? What should AI do? What role will AI play within this recruiting function? How will the role of the recruiter change with AI? And we really wanted to dive into that. And the message that we came out with the data and with our interviews is that it's not replacing the role of the recruiter. It can absolutely enhance the role of the recruiter, enable the role of the recruiter, but, there's still a lot of misinformation out there.
Yeah. So let's talk about AI. I mean, your report was very candid about the gap between like what AI is being asked to do and what it's actually delivering. So what's your read on where the market really is right now?
So it's interesting, I think everyone feels that they're behind, right? Everyone feels that everyone else is advancing in AI and our organization is so behind. And we found that every company is sort of on the same journey, right? Everyone's on the same journey with AI. They're trying to figure it out. They're using AI within different areas. We have a chart or a graph within the report that shows what AI can be doing within a recruiting function and what recruiters can be doing. So we wanted to really look at like the ecosystem of how this work gets done and how recruiters are doing their work within the workflow and what can recruiters spend their time on and then what AI can help enable within that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious, like I guess what exactly did you find within what AI is actually able to deliver, like within the exact workflows today versus areas where there's still a lot of opportunity or maybe a lot of buzz around what people think it can do, but it's not quite there yet.
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of companies are using AI for specific use cases, like not broadly throughout all of TA. Screening's a huge use case that came up as kind of number one when we looked at the research. Candidate communication to be able to take on a lot of that communication. Sourcing is another big area. Interviewing and assessment is sort of becoming an area that is gaining a lot of traction, but we still see companies are a little bit lower to adopt AI in those areas. And that
Mm.
can be anything from transcribing an interview, recording an interview. I know you made the acquisition of Ezra. That's been a big focus for Greenhouse too. But, there's, so I think kind of the point I'd make and the way to answer the question is there are lots of different places to start using AI, and we're not seeing a lot of companies using it as broadly throughout TA as, I think we might think they are.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm glad you brought up voice AI. That's sort of the next, like, what's on the horizon for us and our team. I feel like we've already kind of locked down AI when it comes to like application review
Yeah.
and talent matching and flagging things like candidate fraud. And even with some of the like, just administrative work of creating job descriptions and interview questions. But I really feel like where we still aren't and where I want to get to be is really being able to see that measurable business impacts of time back. And not only that, but like force multiplication, which I'm hoping voice AI is able to be like kind of that first step towards that recruiters will really see a difference and candidates too.
Absolutely. And there's, some of these areas are really low risk. And then there's other areas that are a little bit higher risk or medium risk too. So I think it's also being very careful about, identifying where to start or even kind of what's
Yeah,
low risk, what's medium risk, what's higher risk.
absolutely. I'm curious, like if, we kind of mentioned some of the areas where companies are comfortable using AI. And we mentioned a little bit, of the low-hanging fruit around like the administrative work, the coordination work, kind of like that first pass work. And we also talked a little bit just about how much, of course, the current recruiting role has changed today since even, back in 2021 when you first published the report. I'm curious, like, what do you think that the roles that exist today, whether it's like coordinators, sourcers, recruiters, talent brand managers, recruiting managers, like, will that still exist in the same form? Or are we quickly heading towards a world where those roles get like completely redefined in the age of AI?
Definitely, I think they'll be redefined. I think it's already happening. And I think for a lot of organizations, they've started with renaming some of these roles, like, whether it's kind of a coordinator, calling this an engagement specialist, like I've seen everything. So I think that's already starting. And I think it shifts some of these roles from being more administrative in nature to being more transformative or maybe strategic in nature. So I think that's one piece
Mm.
of it. There's another school of thought. I don't know where I land on this one yet, but it's the idea that maybe we won't see a lot of these specialists on a recruiting function. We'll see super recruiters or even rec ops having kind of a bigger role in being able to do a lot of these different areas. So both, I think, conversations are happening right now. I absolutely we're going to see a reevaluation of the traditional roles on a recruiting function. I think that's healthy and normal, and I think we're already seeing that. And then I think the idea comes to how much does this change? Is this just a renaming? Is this just a reprioritizing, or is this a truly changing up the model completely?
Mhm. Do you think that recruiters will have to just lean more into certain strengths and skills that they already have and display within the recruiting process, or more so there's going to be like a large enablement conversation around how TA leaders who might be listening into this podcast, like how they would have to enable their folks to evolve their role in this new age of AI?
I think both needs to happen. I think what's unfortunately, like what we found in our research is like a lot of the time where recruiters spend a lot of their time is very administrative work, right?
Hmm.
It's scheduling interviews, it's thinking about just coordination, communication that is just, all around scheduling. So, I think where if you ask someone why did they become a recruiter, it's not typically to schedule interviews. It's often to engage with candidates, to help someone find their first job, if that's, an entry level recruiter, to, kind of help people find kind of their path within the organization. So that engagement, that human side of recruiting, I think AI can enable more of that. And I think that absolutely will happen. So I think less of the work that's happening now, more of the work that recruiters would like to be doing will happen. And those skills that are inherent to recruiters, to many recruiters anyway, will, be part of this new kind of idea of work. But I do think there needs to be a reskilling too. So I think for TA leaders listening, AI is not going anywhere. We're not seeing this go away. It's here to stay. And the ecosystem of how recruiting gets done today isn't just all of these specialists on a team doing different jobs. It's recruiters, it's AI, it's data, it's technology. There's an ecosystem that includes humans, but it also includes technology. And that will require naturally some reskilling. Even to give this example, at the Open for Ops conference, both in New York and San Francisco, a big topic of conversation on recruiting teams and by a lot of rec ops leaders was how we manage the build versus buy strategy on the teams, encouraging recruiters to build a lot of their exciting agentic, capabilities to help them do their jobs. But at the same time, understanding that there's a technology platform in place and that has a governance framework and that can support the organization too, and how they balance both things. That's a very different skill set, right? We've never had to manage recruiters going out and building their own agents to recruit differently. So I think both things are happening. I think it's getting recruiters back to the human side and at the same time also thinking about the reskilling.
Yeah. And I think with AI, of course, there's going to be curiosity and excitement as well as skepticism and fear. And I think all of those can live in the same human and it's okay. And I actually found that for Open for Ops, there was a lot of that type of talk, which was very humanly refreshing. It's not all just like, oh, it's going to be great. Like there were some people that are like, yeah, and it's kind of, scary. And I think some recruiters wonder naturally, like, okay, if I have voice AI doing recruiter screens, like, what does that mean for me? Or what does that mean for
Right.
my role? And the way we're currently viewing our team is it doesn't mean that it replaces the recruiter. It doesn't mean that there's, a need for less recruiters. It's not always just about efficiency and saving time. It's really, and I know I said this before, but more about like force multiplication, where what I've told my team is if you get, X amount of hours back a week, I don't know, let's say, 15 hours or whatever you spend, interviewing, what could you do at that time? And really the answers are like leaning into the candidate experience, candidates that are currently in the pipeline. What would you do if you could shoot them a text or a call, every few days versus, every week or what have you, and like really be able to guide them along the process. And same thing on the hiring manager side. Like what if instead of your weekly syncs, you were able to like very, very closely be involved and use AI with, more of the strategic hiring manager alignment sessions and just stuff like that. So I just see it like amplifying and becoming a much better experience
Right.
for like almost an experience that a hiring manager and candidate would have if a recruiter is working like two recs versus the rec load that they have is what I hopefully think is the goal with AI.
Yeah. It's enabling the experience, not replacing that experience.
Yeah,
100%.
exactly. So the report breaks the problem around the current state of the recruiter across process, technology, and roles. I would love if you could just walk us through what you found in each of those areas.
Yeah, absolutely. So we looked at the current state first. So that was, kind of looking at what's this experience today. And the data that I mentioned earlier, we found in 2021, 58% of recruiters felt misunderstood by executives at their organization or their roles misunderstood. That increased to 64% this year. So it's a lot, higher of a percentage, which is a little unnerving. And I think we found 47% of recruiters feel that word I said before, overwhelmed, and that their role is reactive. That's how they describe it today. I think a lot of the challenges with this do more with less came up in kind of the process. When we looked at the process piece, is recruiters have to do more, and the process and the workflow doesn't always match what that workload can be. The technology was very similar. A lot of the technology selected by an organization or by TA leadership is often not the technology that recruiters want to use or know how to use. So the technology often doesn't fit within their workflow. So a lot of the technology available isn't necessarily technology that's improving the recruiter experience, and it's not thought about from that lens. So that was sort of the current state. When we looked at the roles piece in the current state too, a lot of those kind of traditional roles that you described that have always been in place or maybe have shifted a little bit over the years continue to be roles that we found, whether it's, schedulers or, campus recruiting teams, early talent teams, sourcers, recruiters, rec ops. So, for a lot of companies, I think there's this feeling of the air is changing, something's changing, and we're still operating as per usual, but we do know there's opportunity to change. And that's the difference between the first report we did and the second report. The first report we did was really to validate the experience and talk about the reality of it. And the report we wanted to do this year was to look at, okay, let's validate this experience. It's a challenging environment today, but we also know that there's tremendous opportunity ahead, and we wanted to be prescriptive in that.
I would love to break down a couple of the things that you just mentioned because they were, of course, super interesting to me. The first is that widening gap among leadership not really understanding, the role of the recruiter. And you would think that the longer a role has been around, or even that an executive has been hiring for their orgs, that would decrease. What do you attribute to that widening gap?
So, I think recruiting's always been a role that everyone thinks they know how to do or knows how to do better than anyone else. And that's not the case. I mean, there's a lot of skills that go into, you know this better than anyone. There's a lot of skills. There is a lot of learning and training. There's a lot of experience, and it's challenging. So I think, kind of there's just the piece of not understanding and maybe never having done that work. I think, the line we hear from a lot of recruiters is like, if you kind of talk to an executive or a manager or whoever has kind of a hiring goal for the organization, they're like, well, did you look on Indeed already? Like, have you done that yet? And it's like, okay. So I think there's just a true misunderstanding of the role. We wanted to shed some light into like how complex the work of recruiting can be and how challenging it can be. So I think that's part of it. And then I think, there's often, I think, unfortunately, a lot of the work that's done by recruiting teams isn't always tied to outcomes or ROI within the organization. And I think we're seeing companies feeling more pressure. Okay, we have to show ROI more, not just with technology they've purchased, but just overall on the team. And that could be anything from reducing costs still, that's obviously still important. Time to fill, there's lots of thoughts about should this even be a metric, but for a lot of organizations it is. Diversity, equity, and inclusion metrics, branding metrics. So they're feeling more pressure to show ROI. It's just not something recruiting teams have had to really do historically. So this new pressure and how do we do this and how do we work with vendors to show the value of what we're doing has been challenging. It feels like it might be a huge overhaul to get some of these ROI numbers. So I think it's both things. I think it's just a complete misunderstanding of the work, and then I think it's this new pressure for ROI and outcomes and not really having a history of having to show that in the past. So I think that contributes to the gap too. I think what's interesting to me is if I look at recruiters and, I have a lot of friends that are recruiters and I see how they work late nights. I mean, candidates can't often take phone calls till 10 p.m. at night. They're taking and fielding calls at that time at 5 a.m. in the morning. They're working very, very, hard. Their goal, I was just talking to a friend of mine who's a recruiter, and she said, I have to work and manage multiple managers and their expectations and their working style. But my outcome is always the same. What I have to deliver is always the same, but I have to tailor my approach and my communication and the way I work with them and engage with them and communicate with them and get information from them in completely different ways. So, I think people don't always understand the nuances of how challenging this job can be.
Yeah, it's almost like being in a field such as client services where
Yeah,
like your schedule is catered to the customer, which is either the hiring
absolutely.
manager or the candidate. And ultimately you have to kind of work around them and their schedules in order for you to get a
Yeah,
win. And I mean, we could have a whole other podcast on quality of hire when you're talking about
I know.
ROI, but I almost wish it was just as easy as like that person's public performance that you hired. If that's just your win,
Right.
like how you track it. It's like how well they do is how well we did in recruiting them. But of course, it's not that simple. What I thought was interesting, kind of along the same vein. So I actually polled my team before this podcast around a lot of the same questions that you had, done research on to see if it was consistent. And a lot of it did resonate with my team. A lot of the results were similar. One thing that came up was, you talk about invisible labor a little bit in this report. And, a big theme that came up for my team wasn't even necessarily a lack of tools. And I think, of course, we're greenhouse software. So we're probably maybe a little bit more unique in that situation. But a lot of it, time was spent like aligning stakeholders. So things like chasing down interview scorecards or keeping the entire hiring team synchronized. And even us who we specialize in structured hiring at Greenhouse, and even though that can provide the perfect framework for this, software can't always force human alignment. So I want to pose a question to you that's like, how much of, recruiter overload do we think is potentially like an operating model where you mentioned like execs don't always know what recruiters do, where it's maybe not, it could be like a hiring team, cause as well.
Yeah, it was such a great question. We could talk about this for an hour too, because it is like technology can fix many things or can improve many things. And AI certainly can improve many things. But the reality of like a broken process or just behavior tendencies within that process can't be fixed with technology. And scheduling is like a perfect example. I mean, I'm sure that comes up for your team too. It's very challenging and the hiring managers aren't doing it intentionally. They're busy too. Their work is doubled and tripled as well in the past year. So when their calendars are not open for 4 weeks at a time, scheduling an interview means potentially not being able to schedule an interview means potentially losing quality talent. And even with a structured process, that's a hard thing to work around, especially when recruiters have to work with these hiring managers or have great relationships with these hiring managers. You can't go in there and just kind of force them to block off their calendars. Some companies are trying things like that, saying like this is forced block on calendars. We have to changing up the behavior, but it's challenging. And I think that's important to keep in mind because it could be probably very frustrating to think, okay, we just got all this great technology in place. We know it works. We know it's improving things, but I'm still facing the same challenges and I can't move the needle on a lot of things that have been frustrating me, even with this technology. So I don't have a solution or a way to kind of solve for that, but I think I love that you bring it up because it's so important to validate that.
Yeah. And I think we have to remember too, like hiring's our full-time job. It's a
Hmm.
part of our hiring team's job.
Right.
And although it's important to them, they have so many other responsibilities that they're doing day to day. And sometimes, we have to work around a little bit of that. We did talk about earlier on the report stating how like recruiters are saying that workflows feel fragmented. And I'm curious what you really think that they're referring to or reacting to with that. Is it that they have the wrong tools? Is it that they have too many tools, or just that the tools that they do have are not really integrated or connected in a way that reflects how recruiting work actually happens?
Integration came up as the number one frustration. So that was like the biggest piece. And I think it's something we've been talking since I've been an analyst, it's been the number one frustration too. Like if these tools are not integrated, your job becomes 20 times harder because you're now manually doing a lot of this work. So that's a frustrating place to be in. And I think that's number one. I think the other piece of it is sometimes technology is selected for a recruiting team and decisions are made. I can say I've been on the side of this as a consultant where we see, kind of coming in, helping companies evaluate technology. IT's perspective is taken into account, TA leadership, HR business partners. Everyone's kind of looking at this as what's best for the business and from recruiting teams. But when we interview the teams of recruiters and collect that due diligence, that feedback is usually ignored. It doesn't go into the selection process for the technology. So oftentimes great technology is being selected, but it's not the technology recruiters want to be using, and it doesn't necessarily fit into their workflow. So that puts a difficult situation on recruiters to say, we're introducing a new piece of technology, can do amazing things for our organization, but we like using what we've cobbled together. We've already been using other tools, and this is not helping us within our current workflow. So I think that's a big piece of it too. But yeah, but integration comes up over and over and over.
Yeah. And even as I mentioned, like when I polled my own
Yes.
team, um, of course I would like to say we do every single thing. We do not ever leave Greenhouse software. But the reality is, like, even my own recruiters are leaving the
Yep.
ATS to do things such as messaging folks in Slack or
Yep.
using different AI models, testing around with what's going to be the best one that's going to give them the best information. And so, I think the more interesting question is like, do we actually need more tools in a world where there's
100%.
constantly like all these tools popping up of we're the best person to fix this one aspect of the process, or we can fix this one aspect. And arguably, probably those companies are the best at what they do versus companies that, and I probably shouldn't be saying this, but like that are saying they can do everything. But are we helping them by adding more tools? Or are we just creating more tabs, more handoffs, more context switching, more clicks? Like, I honestly think there is probably a strong argument that the future isn't about stacking on endless point
100%.
solutions to have like a Frankenstein tech stack, but like really optimizing a few core systems that work really well together that could reduce some of that over time.
100%. I mean, this is the core of the problem. And like for the 2021 report, at that time, recruiting like teams had huge budgets. Like you could go buy tons of technology. So companies were going out there and saying, we've shifted to remote work. DE&I is now a huge priority for us. Things that were not priorities before are now priorities. And then we have now a budget of a couple million extra dollars, and we're going to buy 10 different tools. We found on average companies have 10 different recruiting solutions. That includes like smaller mid-market companies. That's a lot of technology to manage. So that's the behavior that we've had in talent acquisition tech. And looking now, I think your question's a perfect question to ask is, do you need more tools? And we found that doesn't fix the challenges today. It's not more technology. The response isn't, let's buy this. It's not going to integrate probably with your technology. My first recommendation always to companies that we consult with is like, go see what your ATS can do. You have an ATS, see what it already does. Oftentimes the ATS, I mean, you see this with Greenhouse too. There's been so many advancements with Greenhouse today from Greenhouse 10 years ago. I mean, tremendous. It's a different system completely. So see what your ATS already can do for you and start there. We don't need to go to RFP and suck resources out of your team and evaluate 5 other technology providers for every little thing. So start there. And then sometimes there's a need for more technology. Sometimes there isn't. So I think that's been a hard behavior to shift. Is, do we need more tools? Do we need technology? And then how does this integrate? I'll tell you this too. We did a project with a company here in Boston, and they had an ATS. It was not Greenhouse. And then they had like another, a great platform that they had for, I'd say, more kind of talent intelligence experience. And the number of hires they made the prior year were completely different in both systems. So you had huge investments made on both sides, and you couldn't get just a simple, I mean, that should just be what it is. How many people did you hire? I'm not talking about contractors or anything else, just full-time employees hired last year. And you have 2 systems that cost a lot of money that are giving you very different numbers.
Well, yeah, there's something to be said for actually really having a single source of truth. And I think, and you alluded to some of this in your report as well, which is like, if we actually want AI to give us the best results, it's whatever you put in is whatever you get out. And so if you're putting in like reports or data from multiple different places and it's not all lining up, you're not going to get what you need out of it either.
Or have a consistent experience for your recruiters or your candidates or your hiring managers.
Right. Right. You sort of already started to get into this a little bit, but like you described the recruiter role shifting from sort of like execution to orchestration, and
Mhm.
even just like the fact that you've consulted with multiple companies. Like I'm curious, what does that shift or evolution, or even just in general, what advice do you have for recruiters and or TA leaders of what that evolution looks like in practice?
Yeah, I mean, the evolution is happening, and I'd say this someone on my panel at Open for Ops said this too. It's get curious. Like I would absolutely get curious. Build a network outside of your own organization. The greenhouse community, it's called Connect, right? Is that the
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, to have access to a community like that, or there's other communities out there in the industry, and build a network outside of your own organization. Get curious. There's so many free and there's great free information online. I mean, vendors have great resources and assets available. We publish research. There's tons of information, even broader about AI, even outside of our industry. I would get absolutely very curious about all of these different areas. Get curious about transformation and start there because it is changing. And I think, you don't have to completely overhaul anything today. Like you don't have to feel that level of overwhelmed. You already feel overwhelmed, but change, to get curious about change, talk to others. I was with a company and they kind of described it as journaling. Like, can we take notes about what's worked, what hasn't worked in the past, talk to other key stakeholders. And, it's not Dear Diary, I love so and so, but it's like real, curiosity within this idea of journaling.
I love that. Big journaling fan in general, to be honest. Yeah, I think that's great. And I would echo those sentiments. Like I, as an exercise, sent out a survey to my team just before this podcast that, and and I made it completely anonymous, and I was interested to see, 'cause of course every tea leader is like, oh no, my team's crushing it and they're doing great. And like you're interested to see that
Yeah.
some of these results are happening on our own teams, even when you think, certain things are great and fully optimized. And I think what that even showed me is like, even if you think you just sat down and reviewed your entire workflow or process like 6 months ago or whatever the time frame was, things are changing so quickly
I
in
know.
this current landscape that I've even made a note for myself now. I'm like, okay, I need to sit down every 3 months or whatever it is and really like not just do a form, like sit down with my recruiters and understand. Walk me through your workflow end to end and like where is there friction? Where has things completely changed with AI where it's not working anymore? And where can we optimize things ideally with our current tech stack so we're not just slapping another band-aid or tool on the process and then rinse, wash, repeat because your report shows like there's a gap between, I think, how recruiters are feeling and what's actually happening.
100%.
Awesome. Well, Madeline, this has been such a useful conversation. I really appreciate your time today and for you writing this love letter to recruiters. Before we wrap, where can people follow your work and keep up with Aptitude Research and what you're publishing?
Thank you, Shannon, for having me on. I love talking about this. So, this just flew by. It feels like we've been on for a minute. So, I have Aptitude Research, so aptituderesearch.com. All of our reports are free to download. And then I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so pretty easy to find.
Great. And for everyone listening, you can find the full State of the Recruiter Experience report in the show description and on the Greenhouse website. So thanks so much for tuning into the Modern Recruiter podcast. If this episode was useful, please share it with someone on your team, and we'll see you next time.